Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arundel and you're watching In Focus. Now, many of you will have read of the epidemic of forced bank closures of high-profile Muslim charity bank accounts and those of established Muslim think tanks, lobby groups and their executive members. You may have heard of the plight of community organisations such as the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, the International Development Charity, the Ummah Welfare Trust or the Cordoba Foundation think tank, along with all of their executive, their staff members and even members of their immediate families whose bank accounts were closed without notice. All at once it seemed that Barclays Bank were being cast as a villain, and then we witnessed after closures from HSBC. Newspaper headlines asked, why are banks targeting Muslim organisations? Well, I'm pleased to be joined today by Tom Keating, the Director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, formerly a banker himself for over 20 years, who has recently published a report examining what is referred to as the uncharitable behaviour of the banks and their regulators. Assalamu alaikum, Tom Keating, and welcome to Islam Channel.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your report was profound in providing a much-needed appraisal of what some people have described as a new epidemic of bank account closures. Often Muslim associations, charities, community leaders, think tanks and lobby groups. The banks have been suddenly, suddenly become Islamophobic? Are they targeting Muslims deliberately for special treatment? What is the nature, size and scope of this new banking regulatory issue?
So what I tried to do with the report was to go back to basics and build from the bottom up. In other words, try and understand the environment in which the banks operate, understand the environment in which the charities operate, and indeed understand the environment in which the government finds itself when it promulgates counter-terrorism legislation. It's clear that if you look at the headlines over the past summer, it looks as though this was a targeted attack on the Islamic charity community. I didn't find any evidence of that. I didn't find any profiling, if you like. However, what I did hear from a number of charities was the fact that Muslim charities are operating in areas where designated terrorist organisations are highly likely to be operating, be that Syria or Yemen or those sorts of places. And inevitably, therefore, they are the ones that are most likely to fall foul of this chilling effect that the banks have when it comes to financial restrictions. One gentleman said to me, it's like the Heineken advert. Muslim charities reach the parts other charities cannot reach, and unfortunately that means that they are more likely to get caught up with the concerns that the banks have.
Now, what is your understanding of the implications of the continued closures at the rate that they seem to have been going in the last few years and the last few months in particular? I've been trying to imagine exactly what a UK-based Muslim charity who's collected last Ramadan several £1 million and has had its accounts closed. How are they supposed to get that money to the deserving, needy in places like Palestine, Syria, Yemen? Will they be putting that money into suitcases?
I mean, in a word, yes. So charities use the banking system for three main things: receiving money, receiving donations from overseas or internet transfers into their bank accounts, storing that money until it's needed, and then perhaps the element which is focused on most closely, moving that money to where it's needed around the world. The Charity Commission makes it very clear that operating in the formal sector, in the formal banking sector, with a bank account is an important governance issue. So as far as the Charity Commission is concerned, if you don't have a bank account, you aren't operating in a fashion which they would approve of. So by closing the bank account, you are effectively making the charity, if it continues to operate in a manner which is not approved of by the Charity Commission. And as you say, money that has been collected will find other ways of getting to its destination, whether that's in duffel bags, whether that's being carried through airports, or whether that's people using their own personal bank accounts to move money. And therein lies an issue, because obviously some individuals have found their accounts, having their accounts closed, as well as the charity they're associated with. And that's why banks will close the individual's accounts, because they full well know that if a charity's account is closed, chances are an individual might try and transfer that money in their own name.
So what does that mean in terms of the whole issue, which is started from the bid to try and prevent terrorist issues? Is this regulatory thrust now aiding counter-terrorism, or is it, what seems to be, working against it?
I mean, I would argue very strongly that in the name of security, we are creating greater insecurity. as I said, operating inside the formal banking system is clearly more sensible, it's more secure than operating with plastic bags full of cash. The system is not new. What has happened, so many of these regulations have been in existence since 9/11. What has happened is banks are regularly assessing what their risks are. And every time a big fine is placed on a bank for breaching sanctions and frankly for breaching rules that they absolutely should not have breached, they look at their book of business and they say, how can we de-risk further? And so what has happened is the water level has been rising slowly but surely. 2 years ago it caught money service businesses, and last year it started to catch charities. And not just Islamic charities, there are plenty of examples of other charities that have started to struggle with their banking as well.
Now, your report stated, and I'm going to quote you, operating in a globalised economy, banks, more than any other industry sector, are exposed to the shifting sands of geopolitics. Banks are required, you say, to play a frontline role in tackling the panoply of illicit finance, in particular money laundering and terrorist financing. The measures imposed by banks in meeting these obligations often have far-reaching and unintended consequences. They can impact the innocent and the guilty in equal measure. Can you give us an idea of the nature of these obligations, these new regulatory pressures that are now, as you sort of raise the watermark in the banking system?
Yeah, definitely. So banks have been required for a very long time to know their customers. They're not going to give a bank account to someone they don't know. They're also not going to transfer money from someone they do know to someone that they don't know. So what that means is that they are required to know every detail about a transaction. The level of detail they're required to know has definitely increased over time. The level of scrutiny that is placed on banks has increased over time in the context of the regulatory environment that we have. So what that means is that as they look through their book of business, they will say, well, you know what, we might have been comfortable transferring money to Syria 3 or 4 years ago, but now, given the shifting geopolitical sands, we're no longer comfortable transferring money to Syria. Perhaps we think people who want to get money into Syria, they first transfer that money to Turkey. So we'll think twice about transferring money to Turkey. So their risk committees will regularly assess the geopolitics of being a global institution. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, if you want to use the financial services industry for bad things, you're probably smarter than to hang around and wait to have your account closed. So as I strongly believe that it's basically the innocent who get caught because the guilty are smarter than the innocent, or rather they are more motivated, the guilty are more motivated to make sure they don't get caught.
Now, your study is entitled Uncharitable Behaviour, and you say that it was inspired by the need to explore the issue of counter-terrorism proportionality.
Yes.
In respect to the new regulatory system and the understanding of the restrictive impact that resulting measures impose on non-governmental organisations, NGOs, in respect to the financial access that they need to do their good works. Now, I know that you're working on another study for the Overseas Development Institute, and that you have managed to obtain unprecedented access to senior figures in the banking world, as well as the independent advisor for counter-terrorism, David Anderson, QC. Is there a meaningful interest in the findings and analysis that you've uncovered from your studies? And is there will, and that's crucial, is there will on the part of the banks and government to find solutions to the problems that you've highlighted?
So the first thing I would say is that there absolutely needs to be a will, because ultimately the banks are operating in a regulatory environment defined by the government. And so I don't think it's appropriate for the government to say, as they have done, at least in letters that, for example, Cage publicised, it's not our job to get involved in the commercial decisions of the private sector. I think if your legislation is being used to achieve something which everybody feels is incorrect, then you need to step in and deal with it. So are they stepping in and dealing with it, which is fundamentally your question. David Anderson, I think, has done everyone a great service by highlighting in his reports, which are well respected and widely read. He's highlighted this issue. He highlighted it in December 2013. He highlighted it very clearly in his most recent report back in July, and I'm sure he will be reviewing it again in upcoming reports.
And he cites you quite often in that.
And well, that's very kind of him. But the important thing is that he recommended in his report last summer that government departments should engage with international operating NGOs, and those recommendations need to be acted on. There have been meetings between Home Office, Treasury, DFID, etc., and representatives from the charitable sector. It's early days. I think certainly the meeting that I attended was well-intentioned. There was a good exchange of ideas, but it's really a momentum that's needed. And the parallel that I draw is with the money service business drama in summer 2013. There was an awful lot of noise, an awful lot of pushing was needed before the government said, OK, we recognise there's an issue here. We're going to convene an action group, convene roundtables, etc., etc. Now, remains to be seen how successful that process has been, but I think that's the kind of leadership and initiative we need from government.
So there has been a history of the government stepping in and imposing relatively tough regulations on the banks, or are they just historically running scared of going anywhere near to that mark?
So in the case of the money service business situation, the government, some might argue, were pushed into convening roundtables and so on, but the fact of the matter is there has been a 12-month process looking at this. I think other things which are interesting to look at is the provision of basic bank accounts to individuals who were being refused traditional current accounts in the banking sector. Banks have now agreed to provide those services. They don't make money out of those services, but the pressure of government, perhaps the pressure of public perception, has meant that they think it's the right thing to do, and therefore they'll do it. And indeed, there is a case a long time ago. The case of Huntington Life Sciences, a whole different situation, but that organisation had its bank accounts closed because of the animal rights issues that surrounded it, and actually the Bank of England stepped in to provide banking services in support of that company for a period of time.
So perhaps we could see a similar situation developing for a lot of the Muslim charities who've had their bank accounts closed.
So there is give and take that I think would be welcome. I think it is important to say that the range of compliance capabilities across the NGO sector in general is dramatic. You've got very sophisticated, almost banking-style operation of compliance. You've got others who I think probably think compliance gets in the way of doing their good business, and it's 2 or 3 people trying to get aid somewhere where it's desperately and urgently needed. So I think the NGO sector does need to look at itself and say, how do I appear to somebody who is being asked to provide banking services to me? And so, dialogue is the way I think that gets addressed.
Now, in the report, and I'm going to quote you again, you said, in recent years, in combination with a reduction of banks' risk appetite and general banking de-risking, I love all these terms, the consequences have escalated. Can you explain those two, the two factors, their full meaning? So
the way a bank makes money is by taking risks. That's what we want them to do. We want them to make loans. The loan is generally not risk-free. Banks can quantify risks. They've got experience. They know how out of every $100 million they lend, how likely are they to lose $1 million. Where things have changed is that regulatory risk has come into play. In other words, if I do something and I think it's completely legitimate, am I likely to find myself with a big fine like HSBC, like BNP Paribas this year? And that is an unquantifiable risk. So in financial terms, you would say that is an asymmetric risk. In other words, I'll make a little bit of money out of providing this banking service, but I've got no idea how much money I might lose if the authorities turn against me.
And when you talk about fines, are you also talking about lawsuits?
I'm talking about regulatory fines for clear breaches of legislation, whether it's mis-selling of PPI, rigging the FX markets and so on, but also lawsuits brought by perhaps private actors who feel that they can find a way of extracting a settlement from a bank because they may or may not have touched dirty money.
Well, I think in an earlier conversation you made reference to the term PEP, which you suggested was a term used to describe a category of individual or organisation which the banks place on a special list and which inevitably end up with account closures. I must say that when I first heard the term, I thought it was a tax favourable savings plan. Yeah. But what does PEP actually stand for? Yeah. And what qualities place individuals in that vulnerable category? Are there many other victims apart from in the Muslim community who are regarded as PEP?
So PEP stands for politically exposed person. When a bank is considering the due diligence it does on account holders, it looks to see whether that individual is a so-called PEP. In other words, someone who is in a position where they can use that position for personal gain, for corruption, or maybe they're an elected official. If an individual is classified as a PEP, and by the way, the PEP status applies not just to the individual, but also to the family and the close associates. If an individual is placed on that PEP list, then the level of due diligence that is needed to be done into that individual increases. And with that comes a cost. So a bank may say, you know what, from a cost perspective, it's not worth providing banking services to PEPs, and we will therefore politely close those accounts. And again, we will close those accounts we'll just exercise our contractual right to close the accounts, and that's what the banks.
Without explanation.
No, and I think it's important to recognise that the letters which some people like Umma Welfare Trust publicised last summer just said we are exercising our contractual right to close the bank account, and you don't fit in our risk appetite anymore.
But based on your definition, I mean, politically exposed persons, that could be any cabinet member or even the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, it could be, and indeed, you don't have to look very far in the press to find ranking ministers in governments around the world making a fuss because an American bank has closed his bank account or her bank account. So, perhaps it's just another area where banks look at the equation and say, on balance, the risk that we might be aiding a corrupt official is too great, and therefore we'll close the account. We're not making enough money from.
Was there some issue over Tony Blair's son at one point?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure he's got bank accounts somewhere, so he may well have he may well have run into that problem.
Now, you've said that users of the banking system deemed to be high risk have found it ever harder to receive, send, and store their money. In the worst case, they've had their bank accounts closed, you said, losing financial access. You make it sound, if I may say so, as though the banks are themselves sort of innocent parties in all this, that they, in essence, are simply responding to market and government demands and regulation, to use that old phrase, that they are simply following orders. Is it a fair assessment, or is it more accurate to say that risk-aware actually often means simply bowing to the pressures of lobbying groups?
I would say that some of this regulation, or some of the interpretation of this regulation, is convenient, and I say that in the report. So in other words, fundamentally banks want to make money, and providing accounts to certain classifications of people and organisation is not profitable. And so if they have the choice, a bank would rather sell 5 products to one profitable client than sell one product to five different clients who aren't profitable. So you definitely could argue that there is some convenient, potentially convenient account closure in all of this, because, and you see if you look in the court papers when the Habshil sought an injunction against Barclays, the court papers show very clearly that one of the considerations in some of the discussions about whether to keep money service business accounts open or not was profitability. Are we making more than £100,000 a year out of these clients? And if we're not, why are we keeping the account open? So profitability is at the heart of a lot of decision making, and out from that comes the account closures. So again, for individuals who aren't profitable but present what the bank considers to be a risk,
or an inconvenience. Now, you may have heard of the Israeli legal organisation Shurat Hadin. It's got another Hebrew name, which according to its own website is an Israeli-based civil rights organisation, and as it says, a world leader in combating terrorist organisations and, crucially, the regimes, it says, that support them, with lawsuits litigated in courtrooms around the world. These are the words on its website. It says it's fighting for the rights of hundreds of terror victims and seeks to bankrupt what it regards as the terror groups and grind their criminal activities to a halt, one lawsuit at a time, it says. Now, they have succeeded, according to their website, in winning more than $1 billion in judgments, freezing more than $600 million in terrorist assets, and collecting $120 million in actual payments to victims and their families. It's no small sum. These are, let's be realistic, often the assets of Muslim charities, such as the Holy Land Foundation in America, who were working to alleviate the desperate conditions of the needy in the occupied territories. The lawsuits also relate to the banks that provide them the financial services, as the case with UK charity Interpal, in that case with NatWest. Can you say to what degree that cases like this, these civil court cases, are impacting on the current regulatory framework, framework in creating the closures that we've talked about?
So NatWest has spent, I think, 10 years fighting civil cases with regards to Interpal. So if you want to point to one situation which is chilling banks' attitudes towards providing services to NGOs, that's the situation. Banks do not want to spend the next 10 years fighting these civil cases. And I think this is the very thorny issue. Governments could well get to a situation where they feel that they can facilitate better application of their regulations, as suggested by David Anderson, for example. But that isn't going to apply to these civil cases. And unfortunately, banks are seen as having big, deep pockets full of lots of money. They're vulnerable to these kinds of cases because it's very hard to prove that somewhere in the trillions of dollars you trade every day, there might not be £1 or dollar which has some dirty connection. And generally, banks will pay to make the problems go away.
And they'll have a knee-jerk reaction to
absolutely. And this is my point, that every time somebody else gets affected by one of these situations, all the other banks look and say, well, hang on a minute, what can we learn from the trouble they're in? How do we need to tighten our systems? And the water level rises again, and more charities, more innocent, coming back to our point from earlier on, more innocent people find themselves getting financially excluded.
Now, this obviously is going to get to a point where the whole thing explodes. And so your report has some recommendations. It recommends that policymakers, regulators need to display, and I'm using your words, greater leadership and to take greater ownership. Via HM Treasury and the FCA, you say the government needs to conduct outreach to the banking sector, highlighting the importance and benefit of banks providing service to the NGOs. You also suggest that the Charity Commission, in partnership with BBA and you probably can explain all these acronyms. JMSLSG should work closely to provide more rigorous guidance on best practice to NGOs. What progress, as far as you know, has so far been made in this area?
I think the answer is none. I mean, the report was published a month ago. I'm being a bit unfair. I mean, as I say, I know that there has been contact between a number of charities or people representing charities and government departments. I've been to a number of events myself, people like Akivo, NCVO, hosting events where they try to get the various sides together. And the very frustrating thing is that everybody recognises that we are going down a road which is suboptimal and which if people had a magic wand would say, let's stop that now. So there aren't many people who go, no, the way the system currently operates is the right way. But the important people see that it's wrong, and that's why I think that really the only people that can say, time out, let's sit down and try and sort this out, are the government. But the other people around the table, the banks and the NGOs, need to recognise that there will be things that they will need to do in order to improve this situation. It's not just a question of the banks of the government saying, hey, everybody, please operate in this fashion, because standards need to rise with some NGOs. And banks need to show greater flexibility. And banks need to, and the Archbishop of Canterbury makes a very strong statement, that banks need to recognise their value in society. They are there for society. They are a public utility as well as a profit centre. And we need to see more of that attitude.
Now, the report that we've talked about, our viewers can obtain sight of this.
Absolutely,
they can download it.
It can be downloaded
free of charge on the internet.
Free of charge on the internet.
Where would they need to go?
It's on the Demos website, and the title is Uncharitable Behaviour. You can find it very easily via Google.
Very good. Tom Keating, it's been a real pleasure having you here in the studio. Well, thank you for joining us on Islam Channel. And thank you for good luck with the project going forward.
Shukran.